Welcome, everyone. I would like to introduce David Abram, our distinguished guest, who is American geophilosopher and cultural ecologist, and he's also the first Western philosopher who has actually been bringing the concept of animism into the Western philosophy. So as far as we have been already listening to many discussions about animism before, here is the person who really can tell you something on real animism. And he has also many on-field experiences from different societies in Indonesia and other places. He's going to tell you himself. And he, in the 1990s, in 1996, he wrote the book Spell of the Sensuous, in Czech Kouzlo smyslu, that is about the language in the modern human world, which this term he also for the first time coined. And then later on, there's another book that is called Becoming Animal, and it's a book on the complete new envisioning of what this whole universe is meaning in our bodies, let's say. But I will already give the floors to David because I'm here just more space for him, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I will try to remember to use the microphone. So I am David, and I've so enjoyed everything I've been attending today and listening to and watching. I am a cultural ecologist, which kind of combines ecology and anthropology, and a philosopher. What some people call a geophilosopher, that is someone who is working out ways of thinking under the influence of the more than human earth. And as an ecologist, I am especially fascinated with what we could call the ecology of perception, or the ecology of sensory experience. That is the way the activity of our animal senses, of our skin, of our eyes, of our ears, functions to bind our individual nervous system into the encompassing ecosystem. But I am just as fascinated with what we could call the ecology of language. Because what we say has such a profound influence upon what we see, or what we hear, or even taste of the earth around us. There are so many ways of speaking that we have inherited from this goofy civilization into which we were born, ways of speaking that actually stifle and frustrate the spontaneous reciprocity between our animal senses and the animate earth. But I'm convinced that there are other ways of speaking, that can encourage that reciprocity, enhance it, that actually open further this instinctive rapport between the human body and the breathing terrain around us. And so, well, one example of a way of speaking that I think can be very common, that we take for granted. We say that we live on Earth, that here on Earth this is happening or that is happening, or we were placed on Earth for this purpose or for that purpose. In the United States, where I come from, the most popular live radio program that deals with ecological matters is called Living on Earth. But I want to say, do we really live on the earth? With my students, I often take them outside and I point up at the clouds drifting overhead. And now we know that this earth is spinning on its axis very, very fast, like a whirling dervish. At the equator, it's spinning almost a couple thousand miles an hour. Here, at this latitude, maybe closer to just 1,000 miles an hour. So which way is west here? Someone who knows. Point to the west. Anyone? Sort of that way? That way, yeah. So it seems to me that we should see those clouds, since the Earth is spinning toward the east so rapidly, we should see always the clouds whipping off toward the west. But usually they're not. They're just sort of lollygagging up there in the sky or drifting a bit to the south or to the north. Why is that? I ask of my students, to which some perspicacious student replies, well, it's because the clouds are accompanying the Earth as it turns, which of course is correct. That as we spin to the east, all those clouds are spinning with us because that's Earth up there. That is this ocean of atmosphere between the soil and those clouds and many, many miles above those clouds is fully a part of this Earth. That is to say, we don't live on the Earth, we live in the Earth. We live submerged in this ocean of atmosphere. Yeah, in fact, I've taken to spelling the name of our planet in English, Earth. I spell it E-A-I-R-T-H, Earth. I put an I in the middle of the word because I, at least in English, is the letter that we use to signify the self. I do this, I do that. And the I is just an upright slash. It's just a vertical line. It seems to me that that slash, we could take it as a pictograph of the spine of this animal who spent so much time on all fours for a long time, hanging out, but gradually beginning to balance on its hind legs, and then back on all fours. But we got so used to balancing on our hind legs that we began to spend all our time standing up. It seems to me the eye is just a pictogram of the upright spine of this primate who stood up. So if you take the eye and place it in the middle of the name of our planet, Earth, you then spell it E-A-I-R-T-H, Earth, which says the I, me, I am in the air, A-I-R. And the air is entirely a part of the earth. It's a piece of the earth, E-A-I-R-T-H. In fact, the air is an organ of this breathing planet. Well, and it sounds earth, it sounds vaguely Scottish, which is probably a good thing. It's a good thing because starting tomorrow morning in Scotland, in Glasgow, is COP26, is the meeting, the United Nations gathering focused on climate change. And so that is beginning just tomorrow morning. I thought it might be useful for us to reflect some on this mystery of the climate, but from a very different angle than you no doubt have heard before or thought about. That is, I want to talk to you about the Commonwealth of Breath, the climate as the Commonwealth of Breath. It seems to me that we don't usually notice this invisible stuff. We take it so much for granted. We don't speak of the air between you and I, between me and another person. We just speak of the empty space between us, or the space between you and a nearby tree. We don't say, there's lots of air between me and that tree. We say there's lots of space between me and the tree, because it's empty. For us, it's just empty space. It's a void. And so it's a perfect place, this void, to toss everything we want to avoid, all the toxic byproducts of our industries, all the noxious brew of chemicals exhaled from the stacks of our factories and power plants and refineries, and the stinging exhaust belching forth from our fossil-fueled vehicles, spewing from automobiles, yes, and trucks, but also airplanes and cruise ships and tugboats and giant tanker ships lugging thick tar sands crude oil to be processed in foreign ports. Even the most opaque and acrid smoke billowing out of the pipes, we think it dissipates and then it dissolves into the invisible air, and we think it's gone. Out of sight, out of mind. Out of sight, out of mind. Well, mind, or consciousness, or awareness, is this hopelessly amorphous and ephemeral phenomenon. Something that's very difficult to pin down. Gobs of scientific papers and books have been published in recent years trying to account for the emergence of mind or awareness, or to explain how consciousness is constituted within the brain. Many of these works are weirdly at odds with each other because there exists no clear agreement as to just what this thing we call awareness actually is. What is consciousness? I mean, part of the difficulty stems from old habits, like our age-old assumption that mind is a uniquely human property, an utterly intangible substance that resides somewhere inside each of us. It's a problematic assumption. Given the easy obliviousness with which we humans shove other species over the brink of extinction and our ready capacity to wreak havoc upon ecosystems utterly essential for our own flourishing, it might be that a bit of humility is in order. We may not be quite as conscious as we have assumed. It seems to me that at this moment in the human story, some fresh conception, a fresh image of mind or consciousness is perhaps in order. Some image that has a kind of wisdom built right into it. So, I don't know if you've ever considered this, but our experience of awareness, this amorphous and ephemeral power we call consciousness or awareness, has a lot in common with our felt experience of the Earth's atmosphere. Consider the air, this light-filled and fluid element in which you and I are now immersed, with its agitations and its calms, its storms and its subsidences. Consider the unseen currents drifting between the soils and the clouds and circulating among us wherever we find ourselves, pouring in through the doors and eddying along these walls, streaming in at your nostrils now and circulating within you as I'm speaking. Like the quality of awareness, the fluid air constantly informs us, and yet it's very difficult to catch sight of it. We glimpse the air only indirectly, right? As it bends the branches of a birch tree or slants the rain, and then we see, there's wind blowing, or maybe it pulls a page out of our hands and sends it flapping down the street. We drink the air ceaselessly, alchemizing it within our flesh and replenishing it with every outbreath, and yet we seem unable to fully bring it to our attention. Itself invisible, the atmosphere is that through which we see everything else. Much like consciousness, which we cannot see and we cannot grasp it, is that through which we encounter all other phenomena. We are unable to step apart from consciousness in order to examine it objectively, because wherever we step, it's already there. Mind, in this sense, is very much like a medium in which we are bodily situated, and from which we simply can't extricate ourselves without ceasing to exist. Everything we know or sense of ourselves is conditioned by this atmosphere. We are intimately acquainted with its character, endlessly transformed by its influence upon us. Yeah, and yet we're unable to characterize this medium from outside. We are composed of this curious element, permeated by it, and so we cannot take any real distance from it. So to acknowledge this affinity between air and awareness is to allow this curious possibility that the awareness that stirs inside each of us is strangely continuous with the wider awareness that moves all around us, twisting the grasses on the ground and lofting the crows overhead. Every organism partakes of this awareness from its own unique angle or situation within it, each of us imbibing it through our nostrils or through the stomata in our leaves, altering its chemistry and quality within us before we breathe it back into the surrounding world. So, is consciousness really the special possession of our species? Or is it rather a property of the breathing biosphere, a quality in which we, along with the woodpeckers and the spreading weeds, all participate? I mean, perhaps the apparent interiority that we associate with mind has less to do with a separate consciousness located somewhere inside me and another consciousness located somewhere inside you, and more to do with the intuition that you and I are both situated within it, a recognition that we are carnally embedded in an awareness that is not, properly speaking, ours, but is rather the Earth's. Among the Inuit and Yupik peoples inhabiting the circumpolar Arctic, this enigma is called sila. Sila. Now, Nikola has informed me that in Czech, the word sila means power or strength. But among the Inuit peoples of the far north, sila has a very mysterious meaning. There are variants in local dialects: hila, hla, shla, sla, tla. All of these voice the same mystery, most commonly called sila, the wind mind of the world, source of all breath. Sila is the elemental wonder of the air itself and of the winds that stir and sometimes surge within the air, of storm and mist and every other kind of weather, but also awareness, consciousness. That is sila. Silarjuak, that which has no creator, constant flux and change, mind at large. Silatunik, wisdom, both from sila, the intelligence of the air, the mind of the cycling seasons and the weather. The great indweller in the air, sila, is the source of all breath, of all life, of all awareness. Awareness, wind mind. In the early 1920s, an old Inuit Angakok, or shaman, named Najajnek spoke in conversation with the Danish explorer Knud Rasmussen. His words were translated by Rasmussen into Danish and then by others into English. Najajnek spoke of, quote, a power that we call sila, that cannot be explained in simple words. A great spirit sustaining the world and the weather and all life on earth. A spirit so mighty that its speech to humankind is not through common words, but through storms and snow and rainfall and the fury of the sea, all the forces of nature that humans fear. But it also has another means of utterance through sunlight and calm seas, and through small children innocently at play, understanding nothing. Children hear a soft and gentle voice, almost like that of a woman. It comes to them in a mysterious way, but so gently that they are not afraid. They only hear that some danger is threatening. Now, when times are good, Sila has nothing to say to humankind, but withdraws into its endless nothingness, where it remains as long as people do not abuse life and act with respect toward the animals that are their food. No one has ever seen Sila. Its place is a mystery, at once intimately among us and unspeakably far away. Unquote. Well, so Rasmussen's written records and many more recent ethnographies make evident the importance for the Inuit people of another, more intimate power, the breath soul, or Innua, that indwells each living being, providing life and awareness to humans, animals, plants, trees. Our breath soul, however, is entirely a part of the wider mind of the wind, since Sila, the sensibility in the air, subsumes all individual Innua, or breath souls, within itself. So, this old circumpolar understanding, you find this all around the circumpolar north. It neatly unties, actually, the modern philosophical knot commonly known as the mind-body problem, the puzzle of how a purely immaterial mind or consciousness interacts or is generated by a purely material body. Because for the Inuit, consciousness may be invisible and ineffable, but it is hardly immaterial. It is rather the sentience of the unseen, but nonetheless tangible material element in which we are bodily immersed and in which we participate with the whole of our breathing flesh. The sun-infused atmosphere is our common medium, a broad intelligence that we share with the other animals and the plants and the forested mountains, and yet each of us engages it with the particularities of our body. And since your body is different from mine in so many ways, so your experience of awareness must be different from mine. Your interface with the common medium of air is necessarily richly different from mine. The still more contrasting experience of a praying mantis, or a grasshopper, or a pileated woodpecker, or of a field of wild lupines, for that matter, are as curiously different from our experience as their bodies are different from ours. Each being's awareness is unique, of course, yet this is not because an autonomous mind is held inside its particular body or brain. Rather, each being engages the common awareness from its own extraordinary angle through its particular senses, according to the capacities of its flesh. Well, I hope you follow that simple thought. It's not just common to the peoples of the far north, however. I do think it opens an interesting angle, previously unsuspected, upon this matter of climate change. But again, it's not just found in the far north. Let me give at least one other example. I guess I have to carry this with me. Near where I live in New Mexico, in the American Southwest, high desert, foothills. But just about 200 miles to the west of me live the Navajo people, or the Diné people, as they call themselves. The Diné are the largest Native American tribe in North America. And their most cosmological power, their most monotheistic kind of presence is something they call Nilchi, which means the holy wind. And the holy wind is the whole body of the atmosphere when it's moving and when it's still, including the sky overhead, the air all around us and within us. Nilchi, holy wind, is what gives all beings life and breath and movement and awareness. Sentience. It is what enables all things to communicate with one another. The mountain, the oak tree, the squirrel, all in communication through Nilchi, holy wind. So they also speak of the wind within one. So the wind within one is a very common phrase among the Diné people, and the earliest anthropologists, who actually were missionaries, heard the Diné people speaking of the wind within one. They thought, this sounds like the personal spirit of our Christian belief. But they missed that the wind within one is entirely continuous with the wind all around one. Now, Nilchi, or holy wind, is holy, it's sacred. Why? Because you can't see it. Because it's utterly invisible. You only see it indirectly. Again, as it bends branches of trees, as it bends the grasses, as it lofts the clouds overhead. But you can't grasp it, and it's invisible. You can see it by the traces it leaves. It leaves these little spiraling patterns wherever the wind goes. So wherever you see a spiral in the world, you know that holy wind has been there. And so they say these spiraling patterns in our fingertips that we call our fingerprints, that's how we know that 10 little winds entered into our fingertips when we were born. And we have similar spiraling patterns in your toe tips. I don't know if you've noticed them, but you do. And that's how we know that there are 10 little winds that entered into our toes when we were born. And the winds in our toes hold us to the ground. And the winds in our fingers hold us to the sky. And that's why we don't fall down when we're walking, say the Diné elders. But there are also these spiraling patterns in the folds of our ears. These vaguely spiraling shapes in our ear folds. And that's how we know that there are 2 little winds hanging out, one inside each of your ears. Wind's children, they call them. And when you are thinking thoughts, when you hear this surge of words inside your head, the Navajo elders say, well, that's just wind's children talking to you from inside your ears. So when you're thinking thoughts, it's the winds talking to me inside my ears. But these little winds are the children of the winds of the 4 directions, who themselves are subsidiaries of the huge body of Nilchi, holy wind. So our thoughts, according to the Navajo, are being thunk not by us, but by the wind. And this notion of mind as wind can seem very strange to us. I mean, for the Navajo, they would say, yes, there is something interior about the mind. You are right. It is a kind of interior, but it's not because it's inside you. It's because you are inside it, because you are bodily inside this vast wind mind, along with the bodies of all the other animals and the plants and those floating clouds. We all live immersed in this mind, in this sentience. And this can sound really weird to us, having been grown up or educated within the schooling systems of this very goofy civilization, until we notice the evidences in our own words, like our word spirit, which comes from the same root as the word respiration. Or here we are at the Inspiration Forum. Inspire, respiration. The root, spiritus, the Latin word, originally meant a breath or a gust of wind. Or our word psyche, from which we get psychology, psychiatry, eco-psychology. Where does that word psyche come from? Well, it comes from this old Greek word, psyche. The verb, psychein, meant to breathe or to blow like the wind. And a psyche, or a psyche, was a gust of wind or a breath of air. even the Latin word for the soul, anima, from which we get animal, an ensouled being, or unanimous, being of one mind or one soul. Where does that come from? Anima. Comes from an older Greek term, anemos, which meant wind. Even such a scientifically respectable term as atmosphere, which we hear a great deal of these days. Where does atmosphere come from? Well, it is cognate with the Sanskrit word atman, for soul, the word for the soul. But the old Indo-European root, atmos, meant the soul which is the air which is the soul. In fact, if you take the words for mind or spirit or soul in any language today and you trace them back to their oral origins, you'll find at least one of those words that names the air as the very body of that mystery we call mind. So, it seems to me that this notion of mind as wind is very, very old. And it's, in many ways, is the strongest contrast between indigenous oral tradition peoples and contemporary, literate, alphabetized civilization. Why would oral peoples have such a sacred relation to the air or the wind or the breath? Well, because when we speak of indigenous peoples, we're speaking of cultures that, by and large, were deeply oral, that is, cultures that lived without any highly formalized writing system. And so, for a non-writing culture, human language is what I'm doing up here. It's speech. It's speaking. And speech, I don't know if you've noticed this, speaking is something we do only by inhaling some of this invisible stuff, and then we breathe it out. And as I breathe out, I shape the breath with my lips and my tongue and my teeth, and I send my words out on the out-breath into the world. Right? We don't speak on the in-breath because it doesn't sound good. We only speak as we're breathing out, right? So for oral peoples, language is nothing other than shaped breath. It is assumed to be the air that is carrying my words to your ears or your words to my ears. That is, the invisible atmosphere is the very medium of meaning. It is the medium of all communication, and it carries all the meaningfulness that we experience in our lives. It's the very place of the spirits. It's the very place where one's ancestors' voices linger after they've passed on, right here, around us. So this is the big, huge experiential difference between indigenous, traditionally oral cultures and modern literate society, is everything we associate, all that creativity we associate with mind and consciousness and think is inside our skull somewhere. Such that I have a little mind inside me and you have a little mind inside you, and then we get to argue about whether that squirrel has a little mind inside it. But for traditionally oral peoples, all of that creativity is not inside us. We are inside it. It's not ours. It's the land's. Everything is participant in that sentience, in that mind. But let me, let's see how I'm doing. Let me try to cash this out a little bit. What kind of a difference might this make if we were to begin to think of sentience or consciousness or mind in this way? Let me give you some examples. I mean, think about the weather. This thing we speak about all the time. How's the weather today? Oh, it's sunny. No, it's raining today. Darn. But what is weather? These weather phenomena, when they move across the land, the particular place where you live, wherever that is. Is it not a kind of shift within the entire mind of the valley where you are when a cloudy, overcast day comes, or when those clouds move aside and it's crisp and clear? Does it not affect all of the people living there? But not just the people, the other animals as well, also the plants. Let me give a few examples of this. Here's one. Torpor, which is a kind of dullness. During the summer, one sometimes, well, especially near the coast in North America, you sometimes wake to a day that seems like any other, although as you go through the motions of getting dressed and preparing breakfast, you notice your thoughts are lagging behind, as though they have yet to fully separate themselves from the state of sleep. A slowness attends all your cogitations. The newspaper today seems written with less zip, reporting the same old thing with the same stale phrases. And when you put it aside, you wonder if a minute's rest on the couch might be in order before tackling the day's work. The immediate tasks to be accomplished are, after all, somewhat vague and unfocused. It's kind of difficult to even remember what they are. Only upon stepping outside and surveying the world from your stoop does the material cause of this mental lethargy become apparent, because the leafy trees, the electric wires, and the other houses are all bathed in a kind of humid atmosphere that renders their outlines all fuzzy and imprecise, while the mountains that usually rise from the far edge of town have dissolved or are wholly shrouded somehow in the moisture-thick air. There's no cloud to be seen in the washed-out sky, only that too big sun hovering in the east, sweating like a spent tennis ball mouthed by too many dogs. Its dull heat presses in from every direction. Lucidity. Then there are those rare days, not entirely unknown in every part of this planet, days that dawn with a clarity that muscles its way into every house and office, lending a crispness and cogency to almost every thought. One feels uncommonly good on such days, and other folks do as well. Deliberations move forward with unaccustomed ease. Ambiguities resolve themselves or render themselves more explicit, the choices more defined and clear-cut. There's a delicious radiance that seems to come from the things themselves, from even the tables and the plush rug underfoot. And when we step outside, we can taste it in the air and the way a few fluffed clouds rest almost motionless in the crystal lens of the sky. And how far our vision carries on such days. When we climb to the top of the street, we can see clear to the mountains that rise from the plain in the neighboring state. Long-term goals abruptly become evident. Possibilities way off in the future seem far more accessible, lending perspective to the present. Hence, planning goes a lot more smoothly, with a marked absence of the usual friction, no sweat. Although, to be sure, we are not always in synchrony with such felicitous weather, with a strangely clarified transparence that lifts the weight of the whole suburb on such unpredictable days, or that wraps the aspen branches outside our cabin with such a pellucid and form-fitting cloak of blue. Sometimes we're still carrying the strains and stresses of recent weeks, struggles that followed us into our dreams and now cling to our face and our feet, or perhaps we're still in the dank doldrums due to the wreck of a relationship we had trusted our heart to. These are the worst days for depression, when everyone else we meet moves so smoothly through the world. Even if we're off on our own, well away from the human hubbub, the despondence can be darker on such days, when it seems that the stones and the singing sky and the blades of grass are all tuned to another frequency. There's an insistent and eager harmoniousness to things. an ease that we sense on the periphery, the whole hillside itself humming with pleasure for the whole afternoon. And yet the mood cannot penetrate the thick pellicle of our pain. The mismatch of the world with our own traumatized state feels distressing, even terrifying, shoving us deeper into the pit. Stillness. Okay. The computer keys rise and fall beneath my fingers, letters arranging themselves on the screen as I list the matters I have to attend to in the next days. Drop off a clutch of letters at the post office, compose a decent lecture for the conference on Thursday, clean the stove and the oven. And since we are having guests, I'd better gather up this year's receipts from the various boxes and standalone piles where I've tossed them and maybe organize them in some respectable fashion. The guests are my parents. They're arriving Wednesday. Tomorrow, to spend time with their 2 grandchildren. Tomorrow, how exactly do I expect to find time to craft a half-decent lecture for that conference? Oh, I'll have to just come up with some sort of outline and then just wing it. Meanwhile, my partner has been scowling at me all day because I forgot to fix the vacuum cleaner last week, as if I have any idea how to even fix or even take that gizmo apart. When I fixed it last year, it was sheer luck. The bulky part fell down the stairs while I was trying to pry it open, and then miraculously started working like new. So all of a sudden, she thought, I'm a mechanical wizard. Huh. Not that I don't enjoy the respect, but sooner or later she'll discover I'm a quack. The last person one should trust with any tool more complicated than a shoehorn. Anyway, I have to remember that the voice I reached at the power company said they'll indeed turn off the gas and electric if I don't get a check to them by Wednesday, tomorrow. Too late to send it by mail. Maybe I can swing by there on the way to Hannah's dental appointment. After the dentist, we'll have to head straight to the airport to pick up my folks. But why on earth's name is she going to the dentist again? What kind of scam are these doctors running? If my daughter's teeth weren't perfectly fine, she couldn't bite her friend Finn so effectively. Even if she comes home, if she comes home again with one more coloring book from that waiting room with all those grinning animals and faces proclaiming how important it is to see the dentist every 6 months, I'm going to sue that dentist for corrupting minors. Why does he need so many visits anyway? Doesn't he have any friends? As the overwhelm hits me, I feel a shot of acid in my stomach and feel it register too as a fleeting wince on my face. Not good. This upcoming lecture has me on edge for some reason, maybe because it's in my hometown for once. And so various acquaintances are going to be there, expecting something dazzling. Christ. As the overwhelm hits, I feel a shot of acid in my stomach. Ouch. Yet something catches my peripheral vision, and I turn toward the window, and I feel my eyes widen in amazement. Snowflakes. A great crowd of snowflakes floating down, a deep thicket of slowly tumbling white. How long has this been happening? I stand and stare for a few moments, and then pull on a sweater and step out the door into a landscape transformed as if by a spell. My steps make no sound. The white blanket already plush upon the ground and layered in tufts upon the juniper and pine branches, as flakes now drift down like loosened stars. 100 of them swerve into my face, melting cold against my skin as I walk slowly through a world utterly transfigured by this silent grace, cascading through every part of the space around me. The surge and press of the week's worries have somehow vanished. When I try to call those concerns back to mind, I simply cannot find them behind the teeming multitude of slowly falling flakes. Past and future have dissolved, and I am held in the white eternity of a moment so beautiful it melts all my thoughts. All weight has lifted. The innumerable downward trajectories have convinced my senses that I am floating, or rather, that I'm rising slowly upward. and the ground itself rising beneath me. All of us just floating up as the snow is floating down. A sound, the flutter of a bird's wings, and a small explosion of snow from a branch the bird launched from. Then just silence, not silence as an absence of sound, but as a fullness, as the very sound 10,000 snowflakes make as they meet the ground. A thick silence, muffling the whole valley, and for all I know, the entire cosmos. I cannot imagine that any bird, any squirrel, any coyote or rabbit is not similarly held in the visible trance of this slowly cascading silence. The clumps on the branches deepen. The snow falls through the night, the porch light illuminating a charmed space through which powder floats steadily down. I turn it off before heading to bed and then step outside to inhale the darkness. Now even the house and the truck asleep in the driveway have fallen under the spell. By morning, the snowfall has stopped. And yet the enchantment still holds. When I step outside and snap my boots into my skis, there is a soft stillness everywhere. I glide between the trees and onto the dirt road whose countless ruts have disappeared. Unbroken goodness spreads itself out in all directions. There is this hushed purity to the world and to awareness itself as I float across the snowy fields. The dentist will wait, and the power company will get its check when the roads are clear, whether today or tomorrow. Thursday's lecture is now forming itself easily as I glide over the white expanse. My body is writing its smooth script over these unbroken pages. Now and then, a high limb releases a too heavy mound of snow, and a spray of powder drifts down in sheets, glimmering, scintillating, and then vanishing into the now clarified air. So, that's a few examples. I'll stop there enumerating these and just, I think, draw this to a close so we can open and have a conversation as well.
Thank you, David. I don't know how everybody feels, but since we are speaking about inspiration and breathing, and there is not really so much air, maybe we can ask for at least one window to be opened. Is it possible? Because I have the feeling like we are bodies, right? So. And before I give the floor really to you, I have maybe one or two questions that I would start with. And the first is, David, you have been mentioning many different traditions that you have visited and whose wisdom you have also incorporated into your own understanding of your embodied senses and the characteristics of language that would be more embodied. And I'm interested in your own tradition. Could you share something from, because you're Jewish, so could you share something from your family background, tradition?
Yes, okay. So yes, I'm giving examples from different indigenous traditions from the far north or from the desert southwest in North America. But if I might share a simple bit from my own indigenous tradition or tribal tradition, which is the Jewish tradition, where we also have a word that speaks of the wind and the spirit as one thing, inseparable. The word is ruach. Ruach. It's sometimes translated as rushing spirit. The rushing spirit is what we call the wind. It's very sacred in our tradition. It is indeed It's so sacred because you cannot see it. You cannot grasp it. And yet it's here. You can feel it on your skin. The rushing spirit, the wind. It's sacred in that it is felt to be the very presence of the divine or of the God in the body's world. The wind, the air, the breath around us. Ruach, it's there in the first sentence of the Hebrew Bible. The world was without form and void, and a wind of God moved over the waters. A ruach of God moved over the waters. It is sacred, yes. It is not the most sacred word in our tradition. That would be the four-letter name of God, which the Greeks called the tetragrammaton, which just means the four letters. The four letters are Y-H-W-H. The Hebrew letters, we'd call them Yud-He-Vav-He. Four letters. The four-letter name of God, we've all heard this pronounced as Yahweh, but this is quite illegitimate because, well, we don't really know how it's pronounced. Because the name is so sacred, which is to say it's so secret, secret and sacred being the same thing, that, well, we seem to have forgotten what the true pronunciation of this name is, because it was only to be spoken in moments of deep, deep necessity and need. Why don't we know how to pronounce it? Because there's no vowels in the name. It's just consonants. Y-H-W-H.
J.
Y-H-W-H, yes. Or Yud-He-Vav-He. But those are consonants. There's no vowels in the name. So we don't know what vowels to insert. Why are there no vowels? Well, because actually, it's interesting. There's no vowels in the Hebrew writing system. Traditionally, there are no vowels. It's all consonants. That's weird, because the Hebrew alphabet is as close as we can get to the original alphabet, from which all alphabets derive: Cyrillic alphabet, Roman alphabet, Greek alphabet. Why were there no vowels? Because the vowels are the breath sounds. A, I, E, O, U. The consonants are the shapes we give to the breath. B, K, D, W. As breath sounds, the vowels were inseparable from the ruach, from the very presence of the divine in the body's world. They were inseparable from breath, from wind. And you cannot make a visible representation of the invisible spirit. And so we didn't do it. We didn't write down the vowels. We just wrote the consonants. Well, okay. So then if you go back to those consonants that make up this most sacred name of the divine, Y-H-W-H, and you meditate upon those like a Kabbalist in Prague, day after day, month, year after year, for 10 years, and another 5 days, it may suddenly dawn on you that, of course, there's something strange about these consonants, Y-H-W-H. They are the most breath-like of consonants in any alphabet. It's basically Y, H, W, and then the H repeats itself. So if you meditate on that for another 3 years and 5 days, it may suddenly hit you like a fist out of the blue that, of course, there is a magic to this pronunciation of this most holy name. And it probably sounds very differently from the way we've heard it. It probably, rightly spoken, sounds something like this. Yeah. Yeah. that the most sacred name of the divine in the Western tradition is the name we all speak whenever we're conscious of our breathing. This rocking in and out of ourselves that binds the invisible depths within me to the lungs of that swallow swooping past, and to the leaves of that apple tree, and to the clouds lofting overhead, and to the soils, and to the oceans, because we are of one spirit with the earth, one breath with the land.
Okay, so speaking of the indigenous traditions and now bringing in this Czech point of view, you know, I think we all here know it because we have in Czech two words, one for spirit and another for breath, which are actually almost the same. And one is dech, which is the breathing, the breath,
Dech.
and the other one is the spirit, and it is dech, duch.
Ah,
So you are saying
Same.
it to the people who know.
yeah.
But before I give the floors to you, I would like to ask one more question, and it really much connects to the imagination that we have been talking about in the previous lectures. Okay, let's imagine that all this knowledge and this wisdom of animism will now sink to all of our bodies here in the room, or also to other bodies of different people that are living around us. And how would you say that our everyday life, and I mean the education or really the jobs, these very practicalities, would change? Like, what would be different? What do you imagine? Just imagine.
Well, I would just say this today. What is climate change? If not the simple consequence of forgetting the sacredness of the invisible atmosphere, or the air, of the breath itself, and beginning to treat the air as just empty space, as a convenient dump site for the toxic effluents and byproducts of our industries. Again, yes, whatever dissipates as smoke out of the exhaust pipes of our cars, we think it dissolves into the invisible, and we think out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, but in the body still, right? Because, but in the body still, because we cannot escape with our bodies all the how do you say it? I don't know what the word is.
Exhaust.
It doesn't exist in my world anymore, you know.
Well, I think what we would have to say from the old ways, from our indigenous brothers and sisters and all of our indigenous ancestors, they would say what dissolves as smoke and disappears into the invisible. You think it's out of sight, out of mind. For us, it means out of sight into the mind. That what dissolves into the invisible is by that very gesture entering into the mind, into the wind mind of the world from which we all drink steadily. So of course it's in us and it's all around us. So for me, there is no easing of this matter of climate change without a deep transformation in the way we feel the invisible medium in which we walk, in which we move. And yet, it's this transformation, it's profound, but it's not difficult. Any child can help us with it. It's so simple as recognizing that, as I think Andreas mentioned in the last session, that there'd be no oxygen for us animals to breathe if it wasn't being breathed out by all the grasses and the herbs and the trees. And what the trees breathe out, this oxygenated air, we take it in and we alchemize it within our lungs and our limbs, and then we breathe it out transformed. And this carbon-infused air that we breathe out is precisely what all those plants need to breathe in for their photosynthetic metabolism. So what the animals breathe out, the trees breathe in. What the plants breathe out, all us animals breathe in. I mean, talk about reciprocity. Recognizing that we are in this incredible reciprocal exchange with all of the other living beings around us at every moment is, again, I think it's something any child could help us and hold us to and hold us within. Yeah.
When you were mentioning that for the indigenous people it's out of sight but into the mind, I really was thinking that maybe that's why we tend to have all these nightmares, you know, in our civilized society. And I would already want to give word to you, so who would like to ask anything, he's welcome to do it now. So there's one question over there. If we can bring the microphone in. I don't know who is taking care of it now.
Děkuju. Židovská, bude se to překládat. Děkuju.
The translation, or I should translate to you?
Is there, I don't have something to, thank you. Yeah, turn it on.
Tak je to v pořádku? Můžu? Ano. Děkuju. Židovská kabala pracuje právě se zvuky, mantrami, zpěvy a podobně. Například golem, tady nedaleko v Praze, byl tvořen tím, že se správně recitovaly určité hlásky, samohlásky, souhlásky. Nevím teď přesně. Ale to je svět lidský. Existuje i něco jako kabala v přírodě nebo kabala přírody? Ptám se vás jako i Žida, jestli o tom něco víte. A zároveň jako člověka, který se věnuje přírodě. Je kabala přírody?
Well, I'm not sure. Let's see. I think I got the translation. Entirely what I am speaking of is the Kabbalah of nature. This is my practice. This is my practice. So I don't know any other way to say it. All of the magic traditions, Kabbalah is a great mystical tradition. Well, I can just say that for...
Maybe just say what the word means, Kabbalah, at the beginning. If I may go this other route, just to say that every great religious tradition, or all of the world religious traditions, have at their heart a mystical tradition. Kabbalah for Judaism, the Sufi tradition within Islam, many mystical traditions within Christianity, and so on. But at the heart of every mystical tradition, one finds the magical tradition. And the magic tradition, it seems to me, is is a particular form of mysticism. It is the mysticism of this world, of the material world itself, of the stone and the rock and the body and the flesh and the wind. It is that mystical tradition that remembers that the word spirit means nothing other than wind and breath. Every magic tradition in the world is, in many ways, has within it very practical exercises, practices for doing very pragmatic things, like how to generate heat within your body in a time of great cold, where to find water during a drought, how to dowse for water and find where there's water lurking within the ground. These magical practices, very material, very practical, are all holdovers from our indigenous animistic ancestry, from the way the indigenous tribes people used to live in this land back
before we stepped into agriculture and such. So magic always derives from nature, from the animistic rapport and reciprocity with a living earth, a breathing earth. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, so more questions? Yeah, there's one over there.
Hi. So you touched up on the influence of the whole on our psyche, of the whole wind. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think is happening to our wind inside us and to wind all around us when we are having mental health problems?
Well, I can answer this only indirectly by saying that my fascination with sensory experience comes from my earlier profession as a sleight of hand magician, and my craft as a magician took me traveling as a street magician through Europe and then through the Middle East and living with the Bedouin people in the Middle East, and then into Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Nepal, living with and learning from traditional magicians called Dzangkris in Nepal and Dukuns in Indonesia. These magicians, how to say this in a brief space, these folks were the healers, yes, for their communities, but their ability to heal people was a kind of byproduct of their more primary role in those communities. That more primary role had to do with their work tending the boundary between the human community and the more than human community, between the human village and the community that includes humans along with all the other animals and the plants and even the mountains and the rivers and the dry riverbeds and the winds and weather patterns, because all of these were assumed to be alive and sentient powers. And the magician's role is to mediate, to communicate between the human world and that wider world, to make sure that the boundary between the human, around the human world never hardens into a barrier that shuts out the rest of nature, but that it stays porous, that it stays a membrane across which there's a two-way flow, a reciprocal flow. They can do this work, this porous, keeping it porous, because magicians themselves tend to be very porous individuals. They are sensitives, or what we would call empaths. Actually, we would call them oversensitives. In the West, they are folks who are just so oversensitive. I'm sure there are some people like this in the room. You feel things so easily that other people's moods percolate through you. Somebody comes into a room and you're in conversation with someone, somebody enters the room over here, and they're so sad and depressed because they just got fired from a job, but you start feeling really sad and depressed, and you don't know why. Or somebody else comes into the room all elated because he just fell in love, and you start feeling really good with that, because other people percolate through you. Other people, you feel what they feel too easily. But in our civilization, this is a very problematic gift. In fact, it's not a gift at all. It's a curse to be so oversensitive. And it just gets you in trouble. And you get locked up. Or you already in school are designated as attention learning disordered. You have learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder, you're dyslexic, or you're this or you're that. It gets psychologized so much, but it also, you have to learn how to move or you will get locked up, whether in a psychiatric hospital Or you will lock yourself up inside and then wake up when you're 40 or 50 years old and think, my God, where have I been all my life? But in a healthy culture, in a culture worthy of the name culture, that knows that everything is alive, everything, the creatures, the winds, the rocks, the plants, and yet each is alive in its own way. This kind of sensitivity is very functional. It's very useful because it may be too sensitive for hanging out with other nervous systems that are shaped just like your own, but it's just right for entering into relation with a frog or into communication with an oak tree or with a slab of granite rock. And so this becomes your role within the society, to tend that edge, to live not in the middle of the society. You can't function there. You feel too easily. It blows out all your circuits. So you gravitate to the edge of the community, where with one hand you're in relation to the humans and the human goings-on. With the other hand, you're in relation to the forest and all the other things going on within the forest, the other beings, the plants, the animals. And that becomes your responsibility for the community, and you are held in high esteem. So I think we have tremendous mental illness, if one wants to call it that, in our society, because all of us are strangely ill. We all have a kind of mental illness that we assume that mind is something inside us. And it's locked up in my head, and you have a little mind locked up in your head. But the other animals are not really conscious. And the plants, of course not. But the rocks, forget about it. And the mountains, give me a break, you know. This is a tremendous illness, and we see the effects all around us now in the world, in what is happening, in the rapidity with which other shapes of sensitivity and sentience are being pushed to the brink of extinction and then kicked over the brink. It's a horrific madness in this civilization. So anybody who is sensitive, it seems to me, who is at all porous or even the slightest bit sensitive, is carrying something of this anguish that the land itself is feeling as a result of our dissociation from it. It's a long-winded answer to your question, but it's the only way I could speak of it.
Thank you, it was a great answer.
Tak kdo by se chtěl ještě na něco dalšího zeptat? Je tady ještě pár dalších hlasů. Tamhle vzadu vidím, vedle toho sloupu. Můžete tam poslat ten mikrofon, prosím. Už to koluje.
Hey, so sorry. So first of all, I think you're a great storyteller. I really like it, the way you are like saying everything. It's a great art. Plus like all those claps and everything, that's like really inspirational as a presentation style. But I wanted to ask you one question, which is sort of simple and maybe difficult at the same time. You mentioned, maybe you did not, and in that case, there's no question at all. But I think you mentioned oral origins of all languages. And you were speaking about Sanskrit, etc., and oral origins, and the oral-only civilizations. And it just got my attention because I was curious, like, how do you actually study oral-only societies and the oral-only origins? Because oral origins, like, how do we know what they said orally? Because it's not written, so how do you know the oral origins? If this is what you said, because I believe you did.
Yeah. Well, it's something that I am deeply fascinated by. Well, one way is because there are many oral cultures that are, unfortunately I can't see you, but there are many oral cultures still in existence. I was speaking of the Navajo. I was speaking of the Yupik peoples in the far north, in the continent where I dwell, there are quite a large number of indigenous, traditionally oral cultures, wherein many of the elders still do not write or
Okay,
read.
so all right, you did not mean like old cultures, because obviously you cannot study the old spoken only languages, right? That's what you meant. You didn't mean like thousands of years old civilizations and their oral traditions, because there's no way to study that.
Yeah, there's lots of ways to study them.
So what are the ways?
Well, for instance, one is by recognizing that there are many oral cultures, traditionally oral cultures, still among us, and you can consult and speak with the sisters and brothers within those cultures. But also, the language you speak, the language I speak, the various languages each of us speaks, without a doubt, they were born in an oral context. That is, it's very recent since we began writing down our languages and in formal writing systems. That's very, very recent. And particularly something like the alphabet. Alphabets are extremely recent. And yet the vast bulk of our human history, of the human story, we lived as hunters and gatherers in deeply oral traditions, oral cultures, where there are no written records, but there are records in many other ways, including in pictographs and petroglyphs and stories that still are told by the descendants of those peoples. And there are records in the rocks and archaeological records. So there's a great deal to learn, but you can also learn a great deal by speaking with indigenous peoples today, most of which were traditionally oral until just a generation or two ago, and still have members that are deeply oral. Now, you discover some very interesting things when you just start wondering about what kind of a difference does it make writing language down or not. Well, I'll just point out one that makes a huge difference for everything we've been speaking about throughout the day today. Only when you write a word down, like oak tree, when you write it down, only then do you have now a visible word that you can look at, like you can look at the oak tree itself. That is, when you write it down, you can begin to think of words as labels alongside the tree. And I write down squirrel, and now I have this visible thing. There's already the visible squirrel, but now I have this other visible thing, the word. And I can begin to think of this word as a label for the squirrel, or as a kind of representation of the squirrel. It's only with writing, with formal writing, that we can begin to think of language as a representation of the world. And so we start to use our speaking as a way to talk about the world, to talk about the weather, to talk about the mountain. We are using language representationally, as if language represents the world. It gets at the world as if from outside, from some outside place. This is very different from the oral use of language, where you would never just speak about the mountain if you were anywhere in its vicinity, because it would be quite dangerous. You don't want to insult the mountain by talking about it behind its back. You use language first and foremost to call out to the mountain. Hey, good morning. Hey, it's good to see you. Or to listen for the mountain's reply. Or you feel the mountain speaking through you. Or you use language to call yourself into the presence of the mountain. Or to call the sun up out of the ground in the morning. This is common throughout North America, at least where I live. All of the tribes even though they are so outrageously different from each other. But they all had traditions of calling the sun up out of the ground in the morning. That is, language's primary use in an oral culture is not to represent the world, to figure out how the world works. It's to speak to the world, to call yourself into relation with that apple tree, to bridge the distance between yourself and another being. Like it's the way we use language when we say to our sweetheart, I love you. I'm reaching across the silence to touch, or across the space between us to touch her. That is how language is primarily used in oral tradition cultures. It's a very, very different use of language and very different feel for what language is good for. Does that make sense?
Well, it totally makes sense. I like when you said that you're reaching out through the silence, because it kind of felt like reaching out through the emptiness, which is exactly what you were talking against, but still you're the produce of our culture. So it's kind of an interesting betrayal of our own cultural dependence, I think, sort of. Because you said like reaching out through the silence, and silence feels like emptiness. And you told us that we refer to the air around us as empty, but silence is sort of emptiness, isn't it?
No,
No.
but
Do you understand what I mean?
the lecture was completely about the opposite, right?
Yeah. I don't know,
Yeah,
brother.
it was, but you yourself referred to it in a sense which is emptiness.
Yes, but I would
is
never
kind of
speak of silence that way. I spoke of the silence as a fullness, the sound of silence, the sound that 10,000 snowflakes make as they meet the ground. I often speak of the many-voiced silence, the silence that is filled with voices. It's just not words.
Okay, all right.
And when it's not verbal, when it's not filled with words, it is already a kind of silence. It's a rich silence that's filled with bird song and cricket rhythms and the splashing speech of the waves on the rocks. So I need to say this because you brought up this topic, just to say the hugest difference between an oral tradition understanding of language and a literate culture's understanding of language, particularly an alphabetized civilization like ours, is that how to say this in a simple way. When I am not writing language down, but language is what is speaking, and so I'm speaking, and you can hear me, and you can see my body gesturing and my face changing its expressions. But any animal walking past or swooping past can also feel something of what I am saying, because it hears the rhythm in my speaking, or it hears the tonality or the melody. That is, even when we're using words, there's still a sing-song. We're singing to each other, and in some ways, much of the meaning is carried in that melody. Meaning in that melody. I mean, this is how other animals hear us all the time, right? For a non-writing culture, it's not humans alone who speak, but everything speaks. Everything speaks. It's not just for animistic cultures that everything is alive, it's also that everything is expressive. Even the mountain, even the ground itself, everything speaks. It's just most things don't speak in words. Once we start writing language down, then human language begins to fold in on itself. And when we start using an alphabet, where the written characters, unlike, say, the more pictorial writing of Egypt or the Mayan people, or even of China, with the Chinese ideographs, where the written characters have images of sunrise and moon and rice flavors floating up, and human implements interspersed with trees. So The reader reading such a script is continually reminded of language's link to the wide speaking landscape itself, because many of the written characters image that wider landscape. With an alphabet, the letters no longer image anything out there in the world. I see a B and I go B. I see a C and I go K. That is, the letter points me back toward my own face. The written characters no longer function as windows opening onto that wider landscape that still speaks. They begin to function not as windows, but as mirrors, reflecting the human face back upon itself. Only when the alphabet comes into a previously oral culture, usually carried by missionaries, right? Carrying the Bible and trying to teach people their ABCs so they can understand the Bible. When the alphabet comes into a previously oral culture, only then does that culture get this odd idea that language is an exclusively human property. And the rest of the land begins to fall mute. It no longer seems to speak.
Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. Ještě 2 poslední dotazy. Tak pane Zemánku. Jo. Tak dostanete mikrofon. To je takový kouzlo tady.
Ale já jsem jenom chtěl říct, já jsem jinak chtěl Davidovi vzdát hold, ale mě teďka jako napadlo, že vlastně jak David mluví, tak vlastně,
musíte mluvit do toho mikrofonu.
Jo, takhle, že vlastně by se mělo v souvislosti s klimatickou krizí jako mluvit vlastně o skutečné spiritualitě, jo? Že ta nám chybí, jo? Že vlastně jestliže není spiritualita v zemi, tak není ani v nás, jo? Vlastně my si nějak hrajeme na spiritualitu možná, jo? Že vlastně jako, jo, máme takovou, jo, že vlastně z toho hlediska to, co David o čem jako mluví, tak on vlastně otvírá tohle vnímání, jo? Teda vlastně, jo, prostě země není jenom hromada kamení, jo? Fakt, jo, není to je, my jsme uvnitřní, jo? Já když jsem právě četl ten jeho text Perceptuální důsledky Gáje jako takový první text, co psal, že jo, vlastně tak jsem si připadal, že jsem jako v moři, jo, že fakt chodím uvnitř a že jsem opravdu jako, jo, ne, že jako člověk opravdu se cítí, jo, jako součástí toho. Takže mě to přichází, že vlastně by se mělo mluvit opravdu o spiritualitě, ale ne, že bychom ji nějak vzývali, ale takhle, jo, jako vlastně v tomhle duchu, že pak jako by se dala ta klimatická krize jako řešit, jo, že bychom začali opravdu zemi vnímat, jo, v tomhletom smyslu. No. A já jenom ještě k tomu jako jazyku, jak David mluvil o tom, že o těch orálních kulturách, tam jenom, když si člověk prostě představí, že vlastně nemá tu reprezentaci jazyka, jo, že vlastně my jsme zvyklí, že ten jazyk je naše nějaký nástroj, který my používáme, ale když jako si představíte, to se dá někdy v takových zážitcích, teda jako samozřejmě já třeba to znám, jako když jsem si vzal houbičky, že jo, tak je to výborný, že tam sám otevře to vnímání toho, že vlastně opravdu, jo, vlastně jako každý zvuk je magický, jo? Každý zvuk má svoji hloubku, jako a naraz prostě každá realita má nějakou hloubku, jo? Která je tak nějak. No, tak to je všechno.
Chcete něco zeptat? Nebo ještě dáme
Všecko.
Dobře. Tak ještě poslední dotaz. Tady pro slečnu s květinou. Paní?
Když jste mluvil o podobnosti, tady jsem, jestli se chcete na mě koukat, tady. Když jste mluvil o podobnosti vzduchu a vědomí, tak já jsem si vzpomněla na nějaký text, který jsem před dlouhou dobou už četla o šamanech, kde se mluvilo o tom, že ti běžní šamani léčitelé používají byliny, používají rituály k tomu, aby léčili. Ale ti největší a nejúspěšnější vlastně nic takového nepotřebují, protože léčí dechem. Že vlastně jim stačí dech. Tak jsem si říkala, jestli jste to náhodou nenapsal. Vy?
It's possible. The gentleman near you was asking about Kabbalah of nature. in my tradition, the greatest magician within the Jewish tradition is Israel Baal Shem Tov. His name is the Baal Shem Tov, which means the master of the good name. Great magician. It wasn't that he had a good name. It was that he was a master of the name. The name he was master of was the name I shared with you. But people think he was such a, incredible master of supernatural things. No, he was a master of
Breathing.
of breath. And he used breath to heal people. He used breath also to help the forest when the forest was ailing from not enough rain. That is linking it to the question or the statement that you were raising. A spirituality of the earth is just, it's what you get as soon as you realize that the word spirit means wind and breath and air. That there is ultimately no other spirituality other than what we are in. We live immersed, embedded within a spirit that is obviously not ours, but it's Earth's. And we create it by interbreathing with one another, by interbreathing with the soils, with the oceans, but by interbreathing with the plants, with the other animals. We percolate into existence this mysterious membrane we call the atmosphere. It's not just a bunch of gases that's held to Earth by Earth's gravity. It's this living organ of a breathing planet. And climate change, this climate weirding, this vast global metamorphosis happening throughout the world to our weather, to our forests as wildfires are spreading, is the intensification of hurricanes where I live has gotten, we've never before seen such hurricanes at such force. It is all a simple consequence, it seems to me, of forgetting that spirit is nothing other than the wind, than the air, than the breath, that this is the psyche. And treating it, learning to treat it once again with the respect, with the honor, with the sacredness that it asks of us. And just to say, such a spirituality has no need of priests to mediate for you the truth, because each of us has our own intimate access to the holy, which is the actual sensuous world we inhabit. And your body is your own intimate access, and because your body is different from mine, so I can't know what is your way to feel or to give voice to this mystery. But this is a kind of, if you want to call it a spirituality, it is a new shape of the sacred that is striving so hard to be born at this time everywhere on the earth. And for all of us who, I just think we need to realize that there are so many brothers, so many sisters around the earth who are also waking up to this simple obviousness that this is my small body, but that the wide earth is my larger body. It is this huge spherical metabolism in which my individual physiology is embedded, and it is alive. And each place, each bioregion, each ecosystem is like an organ of this wider life. What are the forms of culture that the earth asks in this valley? And of course, they will be different from what is needed on the other side of that mountain range, because each place is its own style, its own organism. And the body will die if all these different organs are trying to act in the same way with a McDonald's on each street corner. but what is the form of life, the form of culture asked by each place by each organ within the body of this breathing biosphere. So that's just a few shreds of a relation to the sacred that, again, I think any child can understand. And anyway, I thank you all for hanging out and for the pleasure of this conversation. Thanks so much. Much.